In recent years, Black women have become increasingly visible in the world of strip clubs, with mainstream media and celebrity culture contributing to a shift in perception of these women. Shows like P-Valley and high-profile figures like Cardi B, NeNe Leakes, and Azealia Banks have brought the lives of Black dancers into the spotlight, portraying them as empowered, savvy businesswomen who take ownership of their bodies and their labor. But beneath the surface of this newfound visibility lies a complex reality where race, sexual stereotypes, and commodification continue to shape the often inequitable experiences of Black and other women of color dancers in these spaces. Join us as we unpack the ways in which race and sexuality are commodified in these desire industries, and how women of color navigate, resist, and negotiate the powerful forces at play in this fascinating and often misunderstood corner of the sex industry. To guide this discussion, we're talking with Dr. Siobhan Brooks, a professor of African American Studies at California State Fullerton, whose research examines Black feminism, sex work studies, and Black LGBT identity formation. She's the author of Unequal Desires, Racial Erotic Capital in the Stripping Industry, and the book Everyday Violence Against Black and Latinx LGBT Communities. I want to start off by first situating what we mean when we're talking about sex work. I think that's really important before we even get into the real meat of what we're talking about today. So can you sort of define what that means, especially as it relates to your work?
Yes, thanks for asking that. So sex work is broadly defined, actually. And I also want to start off by saying not everyone who is exchanging sexual services for money identifies as a sex worker. So sex work is both a term that was coined by Carol Lee, who was a former prostitute who sadly passed away recently. And it was coined in like the late 70s and early 80s as a sort of intervention to the anti-porn feminists that was happening in the second wave feminism. And so for me, sex work is not just prostitution, though I think that's what most people kind of think about, but it's sort of like an umbrella term to look at many types of sexual services that are in exchange for monetary value. So exotic dancing, which is my expertise, phone sex, which is also something I had done in college, porn, erotic massage, webcam, all of those fall under sex work. But I think we tend to only look at prostitution and then even within that street prostitution, but it's a lot more complex than that.
I know in the 90s, you led the movement that resulted in the first sex workers union from the strip club in San Francisco. And again, as I said earlier offline, that's where I remember your work from, which tells you how old I am for remembering that. And it was so powerful because it was this link between someone who was in the field, but also doing this academic critique of what was going on. So that's what jumped out for me. And if anybody's interested, you can follow this in the documentary Live Girls Unite. Your work was one of the earliest ones that included a lived experience from a research perspective. Can you tell us about your journey from there and even to where you are today as an academic?
So I'm from San Francisco. I was a student, you mentioned the 90s. I was also a college student in the early 90s. And so I got introduced to the Lusty Lady, ironically enough, in what we used to call women's studies back in the day. Now it's gender and sexuality, but back then it was just women's studies. And it was interesting because it started off as a conversation around how financial aid wasn't covering all of our expenses at the time. And one of my classmates, most of my classmates were white. She was like, have you ever thought about dancing? And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And she was like, I work at the Lusty Lady. And I had heard of the Lusty Lady because in San Francisco, it had a reputation of being actually kind of a feminist space. This was at a time where sex work was not commonly shown on TV the way it is now, and it was very taboo. I equate it with how it was to be gay or lesbian back in the 90s, where people were ashamed. There was a lot of ramifications that could happen if people were outed as sex workers. So it was still very, very taboo, and you didn't have the commodification of it yet. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I auditioned because you have to audition. I was 22, as I mentioned at the time. It was exciting. Like I didn't have any of the issues that a lot of other women would have. Like, I don't want to, have people see me. I actually wanted people to see me. I was like, I used to be a model for nude art classes. So I was sort of used to nudity and modeling and such when I was younger. And one of the things that surprised me was during the audition, there was a Black woman. Her stage name was Josephine, and there was a white woman. They were what we would call kind of stage managers. They were the managers that would hire you, and they would look at you during the audition. And I remember at the time you couldn't have tattoos, you couldn't have piercings. I had just got a navel piercing, so I wore a little some little ribbon or something around my stomach area to kind of cover it up. But I noticed the white girls had tattoos. Some of them had, other things. And so I remember even in the audition, there was this sense of, should we hire her? Like this sense of like, you barely made it. Like I barely made the audition.
Wow.
And so long story short, when I got in there, I started to realize that it was mostly white and that on stage, they never allowed more than one Black woman to work. So on stage, you might have 5 women. One was Black, but they never had more than one. And then they didn't have any Black dancers in what was called the private pleasures booth, which is sort of like a VIP lounge today. I should say there was no touching. There was no lap dancing. This was like an old school peep show, but that was where you could make the most money. So at that time, you could make $60 for like 5 minutes versus, a quarter or a couple of dollars for 3 minutes on the stage.
Right.
And when I approached the show director, who was also Black, and she was a former dancer, and I said, well, why aren't there any Black women here? She was the one that said, because Black women don't sell. White men don't want to see Black women for the $5 that it would take to start that up for 3 minutes versus the quarter on stage. And I was shocked by that. And so that's what started the union work on my end, because I got a petition. I was like, there's no proof of that. And so other dancers had other grievances, which you saw from the documentary. People were videotaping us. There were some other security issues. And so then, because the management obviously didn't want the union, they started to allow Black women to rotate in the private pleasures booth, but we knew we needed the union to secure that. So that was how I started as a union organizer.
And how did this link to then your academic career?
So I was on 2 fronts at that time. So I was working at the Lusty and I was very involved in our union. But I was also very aware of the whiteness of it, the privilege. Like this was a very privileged movement. We used to joke that the Lusty Lady was like the Yale of strip clubs. And we actually have alumni. Like we call ourselves Lusty alumni. It had a history of women who wrote books, women who went to college. Most of the women there were college educated. So again, it wasn't the stereotype of what people thought, but at the same time, I was one of 5 Black women. So I started to, while I was working at the Lusty, I wanted to know what's the other experience for Black and Latina women who are not at the Lusty. And so that's when I started doing informal field work. And I looked at the other strip clubs that were in like the seedier areas, the areas that were deemed unsafe. They definitely were not in a position to unionize. And I interviewed some people who worked there, and I started publishing those individual interviews. And I realized there was something here, but I needed to go on to grad school. So after like 5 years of working at the Lusty and being part of the union, I applied to the New School in New York in sociology to get my master's and later a PhD. And I was 27 at the time when I left the Lusty Lady to start a master's. And I just continued that research in New York. And that became the basis of my book, Unequal Desires, Racial Erotic Capital in the Stripping Industry.
Let's jump to your book. Can you sort of break down the ways in which race and capital plays out in terms of sex work?
I think I'll start with saying, like most people who come to this subject, I was actually surprised at how racist the sex industry was. I think because of the media and because of the lack of racial exposure to different women, we assume that because it involves nudity, that anybody could do it. You could just sort of walk in off the street and like audition and that really wasn't the case. So the book is really looking at how It's looking at a couple of things. The first part is actually looking at Black feminism itself and taking on theories by kind of famous Black feminists, such as, say, Patricia Hill Collins, and how she has a lot of theories around how Black women are exploited and hypersexualized. And I wanted to first take that because some of the pushback I got from other Black women was that my work reinforced those stereotypes, right? And my argument was actually the same stereotypes that people like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and, Pat Hill Collins talks about in terms of how Black women are seen and sexually exploited actually work against us also in an industry that is around sex. It doesn't give you a one-up. The same stereotypes around a Jezebel and similar to what you and your co-editor had done in your own book in Black women's psychology. Those stereotypes do not help Black women who are actually in the sex industry, and they actually do the opposite. The stereotypes make it so that customers come into, in this case, strip clubs, and they don't want to pay market value for a Black woman's body. They think that that's for free. They think they can do whatever they want in strip clubs that are populated mostly by Black and Latina women because of those very same stereotypes. So that was the first thing, in that those stereotypes do not make sex work easier for Black women. They harm sex workers of color the same way we're all harmed under them. And the second thing I wanted to look at was sort of similar to how there's housing discrimination. I wanted to make an argument that strip clubs are also highly segregated by similar features. So I had compared a white middle-class club in Manhattan, and then I compared a working class, predominantly Black club in the Bronx to argue that a lot of the features that we look at in sociology around stratification play out. At the strip club in the Bronx, you had check cashing places, Kentucky Fried Chicken. You had, all of those disinvestment features that haunt a lot of our neighborhoods. And then in the white area, it was the opposite. It was in the heart of Manhattan. You had businessmen, you had access to cabs, you had a lot of amenities that you don't in a Black one, and even in a queer one, because I wanted to also look at how in same-sex exchanges, they're not void of these things either, even though it's all women. Colorism was evident in lesbian strip clubs, marketing, having white women on the billboards, even though there are no white women that work there. So I wanted to really look at how, when we think about capitalism from a Marxist perspective, we really have to look at how sexuality is a key component, particularly for women and female-bodied people, and how their value is going to be dealt out, so to speak, on the field of capitalism. And erotic capital, and racialized erotic capital specifically, which is what I look at, is an understudied dimension of the economic exploitation of Black women.
I like that term you said, racialized erotic capital.
Mm-hmm. So there's already a term that was coined by Professor Elijah Green, who's a Canadian sociologist, and he looked at like gay men and sort of, erotic capital in terms of like dating markets. And so what I wanted to do was put race into it. So I kind of played off that and coined racialized erotic capital to mean that this is a type of capital that's predicated around facial features, skin color, how you look, hair texture, speech, all of the ways in which we think about desirability, particularly in the sex industry, and how women utilize those things to kind of get ahead, if you will, in this industry. So people say, okay, you sound white on the phone. That'll help you if you're a sex worker, even if you're dark skinned, for instance, or if you're working in a club that's predominantly of color, if you look like Beyonce, for instance, that's going to put you above somebody that is darker skin, even though you're all of the same race, right? And so or education or things that are performed around class, right? Because then if you have a higher class performance, then that means you might be able to get a client that has more money and has more education. So all of that plays into racialized erotic capital, which is a form of capital based on how desirable one is. And that has a lot of racial features to it.
I appreciate that you're talking about how Black women's bodies and sex work are really consumed or evaluated differently according to what space you're in, like whether it's a white club or a Black club, or how people assume you are online. Can you dive a little bit more into the ways in which, particularly in Black spaces, how Black sex workers are evaluated? Because we'd assume they're not being discriminated against.
Yes. One of the things that come to my mind when I think about Black strip clubs is that show P-Valley, which a lot of people are into. And the minute I talk about Black strippers, they're like Atlanta, P-Valley. And I think that's a really interesting space and show. So it kind of coincides with what I found in my own research. So if you're Black and you're working in a predominantly white club, you're going to be most likely minoritized, just like any other job that we're tokenized in. But then you kind of reap these weird benefits also of being in a white space. So you might be the only one on stage, you're tokenized, but you might be safer. There might be more amenities. There's more investment in the club, but you have to fight more to be a part of it. And then you may not be paid the same in a white club, right? The opposite kind of happens in a Black club, but there's still devaluation. It's just a little different. So in a predominantly Black club where you may not have overt white supremacy, you might be in higher numbers. You may not be tokenized. However, you most likely will be in an area that's disinvested in. And then you have, for men of all races, the perception that Black bodies have less worth. People come in and you might say, oh, lap dance is $20. And a guy might say, well, why I gotta pay 20? Why can't I get it for 10? Why can't I get it for 15? Or there's more of this messaging that Black female bodies are just there for you to touch. Like there's no barriers, right? Like in the strip club, it's still a space and there's a certain etiquette when customers come in, and somehow that goes out the window when people find themselves in what's deemed to be a predominantly Black strip club where people are touching you, the security is laxed. And unfortunately, that's happening when there's Black men looking at Black dancers because they feel like often those are their women and those bodies should be for them anyway. And so what happens there is you may make more money, actually. Like you do hear of some Black dancers in clubs such as that, like in Atlanta, where they might have a really good night and make a lot of money, more than they would in a predominantly white club, but you're subject to more danger as a result.
What about Black queer women or immigrant women? How do these intersecting identities add different layers of evaluation or impact on these women who are engaging in this work?
That's a great question. I'll start with the club I looked at in my book, which was a lesbian club in Oakland, California. And so I think there was definitely a different kind of meaning to a strip club for queer women. So I think in a heterosexual sense, it's strictly monetary value. It's strictly sexual desirability. And I think for queer women, the club has multiple meanings. I think a lot of it's a part of a community. We don't have a lot of spaces as lesbians. So that's sort of an old relic to back in the day where it's like you had lesbian clubs more, you have entertainment, but the entertainment isn't just for sex. It's really a way to form a community. And so that's there, particularly for Black lesbians in urban areas. And then I think security can be an issue as well. I think that what I learned is, when you look at women internalize patriarchal values too, particularly like masculine identified women, studs, what we used to call butches back in the day. So just because it's lesbian doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be safer or there's some feminism to it per se. And so I think, though, that the difference there when you're looking at queerness is it's also more community building in terms of trying to have access to resources, because many things happen in those clubs. Information happens about different things, different events in the community. Networking happens in a different way than in a straight club. So I think that's different. I think with immigrant women, that can be complicated versus are you undocumented, particularly in this era, right? What kind of sex work can you do, right? And I think it depends on where you're from, right? So back to erotic capital, if you're from Latin America, right, and you look a certain way, then there's the sexy Latina stereotype that, some people can work a little bit more in their advantage, right, when they're looking at erotic capital. And I think if you're undocumented, then that also comes into play in terms of what kind of activism is available for dancers such as that. You're not going to be at the Lusty, most likely. You're going to be at the clubs where there are these other things happening that are more questionable, but that's where you are. So the activism will be different. I think those are the key things I think about when I think about immigrant women / queer women, that networking and the spaces function differently for them.
You brought up earlier the example of P-Valley, and we're seeing more and more normalization or visuals about women in sex work. And P-Valley is, of course, specifically stripping, but we're also seeing, like you said, phone sex, we're seeing webcams, and then even celebrities like Cardi B is one of the biggest rappers. And what she embraces is that she was involved in stripping. Do you think that this is shifting Black women's experiences or the ways in which people look at Black women around sex work?
That's an interesting question. I've thought about it a lot because on the one hand, there is more representation. However, I think we can kind of flip that question to look at Black people in general. Like if we think because there's more representation of Black people in various things like TV shows, I think about Shonda Rhimes, does that equate that we're treated differently or better as a result of more multifaceted images in the media, right? And so it's the kind of same thing with this, where I think in many ways it's entertainment for people. It doesn't necessarily shift deeply. And I think part of that is because racial segregation. It's like we're still dealing with a very deeply racially stratified society where images of Black people they just are entertainment, but they don't necessarily translate into you go to a strip club and it's like, oh, I think I'm really going to tip that dancer really well because she looks like Cardi B. I think almost the opposite still happens. And I think that even our images in the media of sex work is still very racially stratified. Like I like Cardi B, I respect her, but she still functions within that realm of like kind of hip hop, that pseudo kind of feminism. But it's different than if you're looking at like a white woman, Pamela Anderson, even though she's older, like those are still very different packaging, different archetypes, and have different outcomes when people actually go and visually consume various bodies in a strip club, for instance, right? So I don't know if it's radically that different. I think there are more images, yes, but I don't know if that really, like, it doesn't translate into women getting treated better because there are more images, or Black women now have more rights, for instance. That's not the case.
I actually want to get your opinion on another phenomenon that occurred in Miami in the past few years, and it's this activity called Tuition Tuesdays. And it was one of the urban Read Black strip clubs had this event where they went around to the different campuses, and we have very racially diverse campuses, primarily brown and Black students on these in Miami, and they would pick up students. And the hook was bringing girls to the strip club where they would perform amateur shows, and the winner would receive money for the gimmick of Tuition Tuesday to help pay their tuition, apparently. Now, it's important to note the universities did not support it, and in fact, the universities actively shut it down eventually. But it does show this link between strip club culture and college women, particularly Black and brown college women. What's your perspective on that?
So I think that is interesting because I think that there's something about that where the strip clubs are pegging these bodies and seeing them you could look at it in two ways. One is a little bit exploitative, but then it's like, well, this could, work to your tuition, which I'm sure it does. But I think the deeper issue is the economic precarity of that particular racial group where they are more in a position where they need to do this versus the white women. That's interesting. Now, I think that there can be, I'm not against, say, strip clubs and education kind of trying to work together in a messy way, but this sounds like that these women are vulnerable to kind of being picked up, especially because it's like amateur night. It's sort of kind of exploitation where you're going there and you're nude. So they kind of get a free show from you. And then they're kind of choosing a winner. You know what I mean? Like sort of like a freebie. So it reminds me of how Black women's bodies are often pegged as you don't have to pay full value ever for them. You could always sort of see a Black woman on a discount.
When we were writing the book, there was another person who was writing the section on sex work. Not Danielle, my other author, but somebody else was involved initially. And she said, I can't write that section. There's nothing positive to say about sex work. Do you think that there will ever be a point where Black women are able to come together and even support each other, if those that are in sex work?
Yes, I am. And I think it kind of depends on media coverage. So there was I don't know if you remember, I think it was in New York. There was Black women who were organizing in a Black club in Manhattan. I don't know if it wasn't necessarily a Black club, but it was a club in Manhattan. And the issue was between the dancers and the waitresses. The waitresses, so the hostess is what they're called, they would walk out on the floor and they tended to be lighter with straighter hair. And the dancers who were actually on the stage were of different hues, and the management, they were sort of pitting the two groups against each other. And so there was discussion trying to organize around getting rid of that dichotomy between a hostess and a dancer, right? So I do think that there's organizing. I know in Portland, there's a biracial dancer, Kat Hollins, who's part of Haymarket Pole Collective. And so I do think that there are collectives of Black women, specifically in exotic dancing, organizing. I think the issue is they don't make it into the media because of racism, quite frankly, and white supremacy. And so even with myself, I'm very aware that when people are looking for Black women to speak on issues of sex work, I'm the only name that really comes to many people's minds because I was part of this movement that had a lot of publicity. But again, it was a mostly white club. So I think it shows the layers that prevent Black women who are in sex work for really kind of coming forth more. One is shame. I didn't have that. I didn't have anything to lose. I didn't have that issue of I don't want to be out to my family. I'm also queer identified. So I've been out in many ways and different identities. And so, but that's an issue for most Black women. I know Black women who are sex workers, but they're not out to their families. And that is back to your question, if they're immigrants, some of them are Caribbean. And so there's more at stake there, religion, right? More, if they lose their family or network, there's more at stake than white women. And I think that's part of it. I also think education has a lot to do with it. So I remember reading something where someone was like, it was a Black sex worker, and she wrote a public piece, and she was like, where's my community, where are my voices? Like, I don't have a PhD, right? And so I think it shows you there are many barriers to Black women kind of being seen in the limelight in sex work. Education might be one of them, because often we point to experts, they also kind of tend to intersect with like academia. There's shame. And then there's also a tendency for mainstream media to focus on white activism more than Black activism.
At the individual level, there's been a big shift to online spaces like OnlyFans or these self-created sites. Mm-hmm. Is that helping Black women in any way, but at least on the individual level?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't know if you're familiar with scholar Angela Jones. Angela Jones does a book called Camming. I think it's about 10 years. Well, now, anyway, I think it's from NYU Press. And so she's been more of an expert in like the online kind of marketing and OnlyFans and stuff. So I think what I got from her was, yeah, there's definitely more individual control when you're looking at marketing yourself. But I also think around advertising, race still plays out, though. You're not totally in the clear from, racial stereotyping or being pigeonholed. But I do think that with online, you do have more control. You do have more control over your image marketing. So, but I would definitely check out her book, Camming.
So what's next for you? What else are you working on in this vein and other veins of research? Because I know this is not your only body of work. What's coming up next?
So from looking at sex work, I've looked a lot at Black and Latinx LGBT identity within Latinx and Black communities. And I was really interested in identity formation, but from a queer perspective. So I did come out with a book from Lexington Press, and it's called Everyday Violence Against Black and Latinx Communities. And it was sort of, unfortunately, inspired by the Pulse shootings and sort of looking at different like responses to that shooting in like Black and Latino like communities. And it just sort of made me wonder, like, how do people feel in our own racial communities? We're so used to looking at how white people treat us and, external forms of white supremacy. But how is it to be in our own community? So that book really unpacked that. And then I'm also working on a memoir. The memoir looks at, it does look at my life at the Lusty, but it kind of goes before that. And it looks at growing up in the projects, because I am from San Francisco, and my mom was mentally ill. And so it kind of looks at navigating those spaces of how do you get from project, kind of public housing, kind of, on the outside, everything looks very grim, right? To, higher education. It centers the importance of education for us and opportunity, and how the Lusty Lady, instead of it being something that most people thought I should be ashamed of, how I really used that to propel myself to be the sociologist that I am today.
Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode of The Psychology of Black Womanhood, where the research is meeting the real world. We're excited to dive into these conversations that bring together academic insights and real-life realities. With voices like Dr. Siobhan Brooks, we're hoping that you find meaningful takeaways that are relevant to your own world understandings. Our community keeps growing, and that's all thanks to you. Your continued support, whether it's sharing the podcast with friends and family or spreading the word on social media, truly means the world to us. But you want to dive deeper into some of these conversations? Be sure to pick up a copy of our book, The Psychology of Black Womanhood. It's the perfect companion to this podcast and a powerful resource for both classroom learning and community dialogue. You can also support us by following along on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads, and by visiting our website at www.psychologyofblackwomanhood.com. Until next time, keep reflecting, keep learning, and keep honoring the lived experiences and research centering Black womanhood.